Welcome back to Educator.com, AP Psychology. This time we're going to be taking a look at the biological bases of behavior, which is to say everything that's psychological is also biological. And when we look at the AP course, about 2/3 of the course has a biological component. So when we take a look at all this bio stuff, you're going to want to definitely pay attention because you're going to need to know it for the AP Psych test. The biology component of the course has 8 to 10% of the multiple choice questions that deal with biology. There are also typically on the FRQs, the free response questions, there are also going to be some biological references there every year. So with this particular unit, we're going to be looking at physiological techniques and a little bit of neuroanatomy. And in this entire unit, we're also going to be looking at the nervous systems, neural transmission in neurons, neurotransmitters, the endocrine system, which of course is hormones. We also have a segment on genetics and evolutionary psychology. And so we're going to look at, and this is sometimes called behavioral or biobehavioral psychology, but we're looking at physiological processes and behavior, including the influence of neural function, the nervous system, and the brain, and genetic contributions to behavior. So first, we're going to look at ways to approach the brain. So we're going to look at some brain scans, and we have 5 different brain scans that you need to be familiar with. You're going to typically encounter 2 to 3 of them on your AP Psych exam. And then ways that we can use surgery or physical techniques to get into the brain to alter what's going on. First is an EEG, an electroencephalogram, and that's an amplified recording of the waves of electrical activity. In case you didn't know this, inside of our heads, we actually have a lot of electrical activity. If you've ever seen The Matrix, one of the things that Morpheus says is that and the body has so much electrical energy that can be used by the machines. And it's true. We are electrochemical machines. And so we actually have electrical waves that are going through our brain. And so what happens is, they will put on a cap like this, or if you shave your head like me, you can actually get the things just put right on your scalp. And they are measuring all sorts of various things. So up here, up in this area in the cap, they are measuring brain waves. Down here on the face, they're measuring what is called muscle tonus, or the muscle tone that you have. And they also have things around your lungs and your legs and a couple of other places on your body to see what it is that is happening physiologically. And so you have to be trained on how to read these. And to be quite honest with you, I can't read them. All you need to know is that when you see this kind of data, this is going to be your EEG. And sleep stages, as we will see in a unit coming up, have different patterns than when we are awake. And so then you see the other ones down here that are measuring other sorts of activity, including heart rate and breathing rate and all of that. But when you see something like this, it's going to be an EEG, an electroencephalogram, the electrical activity of the brain. A second form is the MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And that's a technique that uses spinning magnets and magnetic fields and radio waves to produce computer-generated images of soft tissue. So when I blew out my left knee a number of years ago, they stuck me in an MRI machine so that they could look at the soft tissue of my knee. They had taken an x-ray. I didn't break any bones, but they wanted to look at the ligaments and the tendons to see what I had done. And of course, I tore my ACL. But for the brain, MRI scans will show brain anatomy. And this is an example. And so while you will see bone, that's not the primary function. What you're really looking for here is the sulci and the gyri of the tissue. You see some of the brain anatomy here, what the brain parts, you got the thalamus up here, you got the pons, the brainstem, the cerebellum. So you're looking at the brain anatomy. What does the gross anatomy look like? And no, not that it's just gross, but the larger pieces, what does that look like? Here's another picture of an MRI, and notice you go all the way down here, and you've got you've got the chin, you've got the lips right here, you've got the nice little outline of the nose, and it shows that there are some gaps in here. and going down the throat. And so some of these gaps are going to be your sinuses. And so if you've ever had one of those headaches where, you have to press on your forehead in order to feel better, it's going to be your sinus gaps up in here. But again, you'll notice that there are lots of little tiny gaps, the sulci of the brain, and the MRI captures that. This is a picture of a functional MRI machine. And what it does is it's like an MRI, but it's functional, which is to say it's a technique for revealing blood flow and therefore brain activity by comparing successive MRI scans. And so this actually shows brain function, not just structure, but function. And here's what a picture of an fMRI would look like. And because of the way the computers are programmed, you can look at and see where the various activity is here. And from the side view, you've got some activity in the frontal lobe, some activity up here in the motor cortex. And again, you can see not only the structure, but also because of the little orange dots that you're seeing here, you are seeing the function. Where is the blood flow? So fMRI, blood flow in the brain. Then there's the PET, the positron emission tomography. And it's a visual display of brain activity that detects where a radioactive form of glucose goes while the brain performs a given task. And so when we say radioactive, we're not talking about the kinds from the 1950s B movies where ants turn into these huge monstrous creatures. But rather, it's a tiny little bit, gets inserted into your bloodstream, and then it starts working its way around the brain. And so what happens is you can measure blood flow, not blood flow, sorry, that was the fMRI. You can measure glucose. Where is the glucose being active? And so you see here a normal brain where you've got a lot of, on the cerebral cortex on the outside, the brain being active, and then some blue, the less active but still active areas toward the center of the brain. A mild cognitive impairment, you'll notice that a lot of area in the middle is going to be not active. And notice it says mild cognitive impairment. And then over here, you've got Alzheimer's disease, and notice that the impairment takes up a much larger portion of the middle of the brain. And so when you're looking to find brain activity and looking for where in the brain it is going to be, you're going to be using the glucose and the PET scan. CT scan, otherwise known as a CAT scan, as it's mentioned here, a series of X-ray photographs taken from different angles and combined by a computer to form a composite image of the slice through a particular part of the body. And so we're looking at a representation. And here's what a CAT scan would look like, or a series of CAT scans. So a series of X-rays that can take us through successive portions of the brain. And so we start in a fairly low point where we have the nose, and then we move up and up and up and up until we finally get to the point where it's just, by the time we get to over here, it's just the little top part, and then by the time we get to here, it's just that very, very, very top part. It's a very slice of an X-ray. And that's going to be a CT scan. So in addition to all the computerized ways to get into the brain, we also have physical techniques. And so these techniques are going to involve things like lesioning, ablation, lobotomies, hemispherectomies, and the curious case of Phineas Gage. And you might be saying, well, what are all those things? Well, I'm glad you asked. First is a lesion, and that is going to be tissue destruction. A brain lesion is a naturally or experimentally caused destruction of brain tissue. And so when we're looking at destruction of brain tissue, we're actually getting into the brain. Not like Hannibal and spooning out the brain or anything like that, but we're getting into the brain and purposefully, usually, experimentally destroying a particular part of the brain. There was a situation when I was in college, and this was before they had some guidelines on animal testing. And so we had these rats, and I had Matilda. And so what we did, me and my partner, we shaved her little head. We drilled 2 holes in Matilda's head. And we did what was called a sham lesion. And so when we put the electrode down into the brain, it only went part of the way, not all the way, to a part of the brain known as the lateral hypothalamus, which is involved in hunger. And so what happened was that what we were supposed to be replicating was the group that had the lateral hypothalamus, or the LH, lesioned. Those rats were supposed to stop eating. Our rats were supposed to live on because the LH was not destroyed. Well, as it turned out, not all the rats, because of the way the calculations were done. We, of course, made mistakes. But Matilda became my pet, and she lasted another 2 years. Know that rats only have a life expectancy of about 3 years, and so she had a good life living with me in my fraternity house. No, she was not abused in any way or shape or form. But we attempted to lesion her brain. And we went through all of the other control conditions in order to make it as equal as possible and controlled as possible. There's also a lobotomy, also known as a prefrontal lobotomy. And that's taking the front of the frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe goes to about right here. And where my fingers are, on the top of my head, that is actually where the motor cortex is. We'll see that coming up in another segment. But the front of the frontal lobe is what makes you human, is what makes you a person. It gives you your personality, your decision-making ability, your planning ability. All the things that we think of as us, that's the prefrontal lobe. But the guy who created this back in the 1930s, his name was Moniz, he won a Nobel Prize for it. Yeah, but sadly, when we look at what Moniz did, we had this huge thing. And again, this was prior to psychoactive drugs being in the picture. And so they looked at surgical and restraints and straitjackets and all the rest of that. And so lobotomies were one way to get at behavioral change. It's very, very, very crude. 2 ways to do that. They either drilled in each side of the frontal lobe up here, and so they the little hand drills. This is before the electric drills. Or they would do what's called an ice pick lobotomy. And an ice pick lobotomy is they would take the ice pick and they would go up underneath the eyelid, and then they'd go, and they would hammer until they broke through the orbital bone, that bone that is behind your eye, till they got up into the brain. And then they would take the little the scalpel and go swish, 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 swish. And when they did that, they were, while the patient was awake, if they hadn't passed out, they were attempting to reduce the symptoms of the schizophrenics. Sadly, it's one of the less pleasant parts of the history of medicine and the history of psychology. Then there's a hemispherectomy. That's removing half the brain. And there's this condition known as Rasmussen syndrome. And there's been some great documentaries that have been on TV, and I happened to see this one. But there was this girl named Jody Miller. And what happened was she had Rasmussen syndrome, and it was a severe form of epilepsy that just took away her ability to function. She was having multiple seizures a day. They were knocking her out. She was becoming injured. And the epilepsy that was only going on in the right hemisphere of her brain. Because that was the case, the doctor was Dr. Ben Carson. He will go, he's he's political now, but he was the world's foremost brain surgeon. But he would go in and he would do these kinds of surgeries. And Jody Miller, cool young woman that she was, she had this surgery in the late 1990s. She's now a college grad. She won several scholarships from the Hemi Foundation, which is a group that helps support people who have had hemispherectomies. So you can have a large portion of your brain removed and still function and be a real-life good human being that lives a wonderful life. And that is because of this concept called plasticity. Now, the word plastic, got to spell that one correctly, moldable. And plasticity means that the brain is moldable. It means that if one part of the brain is injured, other parts of the brain can pick up the slack, so to speak, can compensate for the part of the brain that's been injured or removed or damaged or whatever it might happen to be. And so the younger you are, it's best with children, that's when you have the most plasticity. The younger you are, the more plastic your brain is, the more moldable and fungible, so to speak, that your brain is. Your brain can adapt to those sorts of problems. So Jody Miller, she had a few physical movement issues, but she could walk, she could run, she could dance, and she was able to handle all of the fact that she had the right hemisphere of her brain removed. The curious case of Phineas Gage. I alluded to him before. He was a railroad worker in New Hampshire, in Vermont rather, in the late 1800s, and he had an explosion occur, and a steel beam, as you see, went up through the left cheekbone, behind the left eye, and out the top of his frontal lobe. It went, and because it went through so quickly, it seems to have, based on the reports, it seems to have cauterized the tissue so he didn't bleed out. He survived. He absolutely survived this for another 20 years or so after this. And you can see these representations of what the bar would have looked like as it was going through from different angles here. But again, up through here and here. And so there was a remake in a series called The Brain, and they actually show the doctor with his hands going up through the cheekbone and in through the skull, and him touching his fingers inside Phineas Gage's head. Now, he ended up being blind in his left eye, and apparently, and this is where there are going to be some conflicting reports, his behavior changed as a result of his frontal lobe being disconnected from a part of the brain called the amygdala in the inner part of the limbic system of the brain. So the question is, what can this tell us about human behavior? And what it told us a lot of is that the frontal lobe mediates or controls what some of our more animalistic desires might happen to be. And these are some more Gage representations. And you can see here where it goes in under the cheekbone and then out through just back behind the hairline. And this shows an actual size going through a skull, another representation. And then this, what his head would have looked like after he healed up, based on some photographs and some other representations that we have of Gage. So if I have a dog, or if I have another pet other than the cats that I have, I think I'm going to name them Phineas. Not after Phineas Fogg, but of Phineas Gage. And then here's an actual photograph. I don't remember if it's in a photograph or another type of daguerreotype, I think is what it is. And you see here that he's blind in his left eye, his hair has grown over, but here, this is the actual rod. This is the actual steel rod that was 4 feet long that went through his skull, and he still survived. In addition to using those techniques, we also need to know a little bit about the endocrine system. I know it's kind of a jump, but that's going to happen when we go through this biology section here. So we've got nervous systems, and nervous systems are going to go through the brain and the spinal cord, and then the nerves that go along with them. And then the endocrine system, and that's going to be via the bloodstream and hormones. The brain and the endocrine system. There's a little part of the brain called the hypothalamus. That is going to be in controlling of so many different things: hunger, thirst, sex, body temperature, etc. And that's going to signal the pituitary gland to send signals via the various other glands into the bloodstream with hormones. So the signals are going to be hormonal in nature. And the endocrine system itself is going to be slower to operate than the nervous system and have longer lasting effects. So neurotransmitters will go faster and be quicker responding, but the endocrine system is going to be a little bit slower and last a little bit longer. And so the major glands, this has all of most of the glands that are going on there. But when we look at the hypothalamus, I'm going to go to green here. When we look at the hypothalamus, we're going to be looking at dopamine. We're going to look at human growth hormone and the gonadotropin releasing hormones. And gonadotropins are going to be those hormones that are going to be released by the gonads, which is to say the testes or the ovaries. We're going to be looking at oxytocin and vasopressin. Those are the love hormones. Those are the ones that we experience when we are cuddling and when we're in love. Oxytocin and vasopressin. We don't need to worry about the thyroid gland other than that it helps control our metabolism and energy. We are going to be looking at the pineal gland and melatonin. Melatonin is going to be involved in sleep. And so when melatonin is, I'm going to save that for later on. Pituitary gland, and then again we've got oxytocin, vasopressin, antidiuretic hormones, and all these other different hormones. If we're taking an AP Bio class, we have to know all those. Not for us. And so only a few of these do we need to know for AP Psychology, because we're going to focus on the ones that deal with behavior. And the endocrine system within the alimentary system is, we have the liver producing insulin, insulin-like growth factor. We don't worry about the duodenum at all, or the duodenum, depending on which part of the world you're from. We don't really worry about the kidney too much. We do look at the stomach and ghrelin and neuropeptide Y. We'll take a look at those when we get to the motivation chapter and hunger. The pancreas with insulin. We don't need to worry about the rest of those. And the adrenal gland. So we're going to be looking at adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine, the glucocorticoids, and the androgens. So those we are going to be familiar with and familiarizing ourselves with later in the course. But I wanted to introduce them to you now as we're looking at the endocrine system. And in the reproductive system, we've got in the ovaries, we've got progesterone and androstenedione and the estrogens, progesterone, estrogens, androgens. Those are basically what we need to know, the estrogens and the androgens. Estrogens are the female hormones, the feminizing hormones. Androgens are the male or the masculinizing hormones. And both men and women have both sets of hormones being utilized. So in review, which brain technique is going to study individual cases? And when we're looking at that, we basically, all of the brain techniques are going to be looking at individual cases. So hopefully you know that that's going to be all of them. Blood flow. Which one of the techniques, the computerized techniques, are going to be looking at blood flow? Is that going to be the fMRI? Taking x-rays of the skull. Is that going to be the CT scan? Spinning magnets to create soft tissue images. Is that the MRI? What about the technique that intentionally destroys brain tissue? Is that a lesion? And then, of course, hormones. Do we know their basic locations and functions? And so go back and review these ideas in terms of the vasopressin and in terms of the oxytocin. We're going to be looking at those in motivation. And, of course, adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. We're going to be taking a look at these chemicals again, both in this unit and in later units. So that's a quick overview of techniques and a little bit of a heads up on the endocrine system. So thanks for watching this segment of AP Psychology on Educator.com.